The honourable member for Mississauga, Streetsville.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today on today's Opposition Day motion. The NDP is asking this House to direct the work of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, of which I am a member, during its consideration of the Fair Elections Act. While I wholeheartedly support the need to consult with stakeholders and Canadians about the important issues raised in the Fair Elections Act, I believe that it is the responsibility of our committee to decide how it will conduct itself and how it will structure its hearings. I'm confident that the committee will ensure a thorough and comprehensive hearing of the Fair Elections Act and will make every effort to hear all who are interested in this important matter. The communications technology available makes it very possible to hear from a wide range of individuals wherever they may be. I will therefore be opposing the motion and encouraging other members to do the same. So let's talk a little bit about the Fair Elections Act, Mr. Speaker. The Act is a vital piece of legislation that proposes comprehensive changes to the Canada Elections Act. The Fair Elections Act will ensure everyday citizens are in charge of democracy by putting special interests on the sidelines and rule breakers out of business.
The honourable member for Malpeque is rising on a point of order.
The motion before us today is not the Fair Elections Act. The government already invoked closure on the Fair Elections Act in this chamber. The motion before us today is about whether or not certain witnesses should appear and whether or not the committee should hold cross-country hearings. That's what the motion is, Mr. Speaker, and I submit the member is out of order in his remarks by talking about the Fair Elections Act. We're not talking about it.
The honourable parliamentary secretary on the same point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Speaker will no doubt remain consistent in his ruling, especially in light of the fact of earlier comments from both Liberal and NDP members with respect to this motion and their speaking notes.
Yeah, I think it's been quite clear that the debate today has engaged in both directly on the motion that's before us today and the motion from the opposition party, official opposition, but also on the essential bill that's the essence of that motion. And it's clear to me, and it's my ruling, that is all relevant. Both issues are relevant to the debate that's before us today. The member for Streetsville can continue.
Well, thank you very much for that interpretation, Mr. Speaker. You know, I've been here all day, Mr. Speaker, listening to debate. Just about every single speaker on both sides of the House has talked about elements contained in Bill C-23 as part of debate today. So obviously the member for Malpeque wasn't paying attention. The bill also makes it harder to break elections law.
Order, order. Order. That's not a point of order. Member for Streetsville can continue, hopefully uninterrupted.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You think someone who's been here as long as that member would know the rules. The bill also makes it harder to break the elections law. It closes loopholes to big money, imposes new penalties on political imposters who make rogue calls, and it empowers law enforcement with sharper teeth, a longer reach, and a freer hand. The Fair Elections Act will protect voters from rogue calls with a mandatory public registry for mass calling, prison time for impersonating election officials, and increased penalties. Give more independence to the Commissioner of Canada Elections, allowing him or her control over their staff and investigations, empowering her or him to seek tougher penalties for existing electoral offences, and providing more than a dozen new offences to combat big money, rogue calls, and fraudulent voting. It will ban the use of loans used to evade donation rules. I'm sure the member for Malpeque understands that one. Repeal the ban on premature transmission of election results, upholding free speech, provide better customer service to voters, and establish an extra day of polling. In the case of disagreements over election expenses, allow an MP to present the disputed case in the courts and to have judges quickly rule on it before the Chief Electoral Officer seeks the MP's suspension. It makes the rules for elections clear, predictable, and easier to follow. It will crack down on voter fraud by prohibiting vouching or voter information cards as acceptable forms of ID. This last provision, cracking down on voter fraud, will be the focus of my remarks today. Each time someone votes fraudulently, they actually cancel out the ballot of an honest voter. Studies commissioned by Elections Canada demonstrate mass irregularities in the use of vouching and high rates of inaccuracy on voter information cards. Voters will still have 39 forms of authorized ID to choose from to prove identity and residence. The Fair Elections Act will protect the integrity of the vote by ending the risky practices that are prone to errors and irregularities. The measures included in the Act will strengthen our election system through reforms that increase oversight, accountability, and enforcement, while taking action to ensure the integrity of the vote and provide greater opportunities for Canadians to vote. Among the important initiatives included in the Act are measures to combat voter fraud and to increase the confidence of Canadians in the electoral process. The current provision that allows for the vouching system in general elections has been used in 2008 and in 2011, as well as in by-elections since 2007. The Neufeld report, a study that was commissioned by Elections Canada to examine administrative deficiencies at the polls in the 2011 election, concluded that vouching procedures are overly complex and that this has contributed to irregularities in the polling process. In fact, the Neufeld report concluded that among a sample of polls from Etobicoke Centre during the last general election and in by-elections in Victoria, Durham, and in Calgary Centre, there were irregularities in 25% of the cases where vouching was used. A national sample based on the last election identified that of the cases that involved vouching, 42% had irregularities. As Mr. Neufeld reported, and I quote, "Serious errors of a type the courts consider irregularities that can contribute to an election being overturned were found to occur in 12% of all election day cases involving voter registration and 42% of cases involving identity vouching." End of quote. Even with increased quality assurance, the report indicates that the problem would not be remedied. This was identified in the Neufeld report, and I quote, "Identity vouching procedures are questionably the most complex exception process administered at polling stations. The level of irregularities for vouching averaged 25%. During 2 of these elections, quality assurance programs involving on-site conformity advisors were applied. However, vouching irregularities still averaged 21% during the OCA-monitored elections. This indicates that overly complex procedures cannot be remedied simply by improved quality assurance." End of quote. Vouching is risky and subject to high levels of irregularities, and increased quality assurance would not remedy the problem. That is why our government took steps in the Fair Elections Act to eliminate this practice. In addition to the elimination of the vouching process, the Fair Elections Act proposes to include measures to improve the communication to voters about what types of identification are acceptable at the polls. Canadians are often confused about what forms of ID are acceptable in order to vote. So the Fair Elections Act responds to this by requiring the Chief Electoral Officer to communicate to Canadians what forms of ID are acceptable in order to vote. Research shows that most electors have identification with their name and date of birth. The Uniform Law Conference of Canada indicates that, and I quote, almost all voters have some documentary evidence of who they are and their date of birth. What is most difficult for a voter to provide is documentary evidence of residence, end quote. There are many options to choose from. In order to vote, Canadians can choose 2 among 39 unique forms of ID that show their name and residence. In addition to providing their name, which almost all Canadians can do, residency can be demonstrated with documentation issued by the responsible authority of a shelter, a soup kitchen, a student or senior's residence, or long-term care facility. These documents include an attestation of residence, a letter of stay, an admission form, or statement of benefits. I believe that virtually all Canadians can meet the identification requirements given the exhaustive options that are available. I won't take time to list all 39 options, Mr. Speaker, but I think it's important to read into the record a few that many Canadians already have. A driver's license, a health card, Canadian passport, certificate of Canadian citizenship, a birth certificate, a certificate of Indian status, a social insurance number card, an old age security card, a student ID card, a library card, public transportation card, a Canadian Forces identity card, a Veterans Affairs health card, a hospital bracelet worn by residents of long-term care facilities, a letter from a public guardian, public curator, or public trustee, or a bank credit card statement. I've only mentioned 16, Mr. Speaker, of the 39 options. So this provides you with a good idea of how many identification options are available. While Elections Canada has estimated that as many as 120,000 voters have used vouching on Election Day, these voters could have proven their identity and residence if that requirement and the options available had been explained to them. The Fair Elections Act will require in law that Elections Canada communicate what forms of ID will be accepted at polling stations. This important measure will provide voters with the knowledge they need about what identification to bring before they head to the polls. Another important matter addressed in the Act is the use of voter information cards. The voter information card is a card that Elections Canada sends out during an election campaign to every elector whose name appears on the list. It informs electors when and where they can cast their ballots on Election Day or at the advance polls. A card is also sent to every elector who is added to the list of electors during the revision period. The voter information cards play an important role informing Canadians about where and when they need to vote. However, they have not been used as a proof of identification and residency at the polls, apart from some pilot projects conducted by Elections Canada, and there is evidence that their ID presents proven risks of voter fraud. Voter information cards are regularly sent to electors with inaccuracies that could allow those attempting to subvert election law to use them to vote more than once or in the wrong riding. An Elections Canada report on the last election showed that roughly 1 in 6 eligible voters do not have a correct address listed on the National Register of Electors. The information from the register provides the information for voters' lists that is reproduced on the voter information cards. In other words, 1 out of 6 voter information cards are wrong. That is why the Fair Elections Act will prohibit the use of voter information cards as a form of acceptable identification. And as I have demonstrated, there are a wide range of voter identification documents that are accepted at the polls that have a proven level of accuracy. There is no need to add voter information cards to that list in light of the apparent lack of reliability of these cards for identification purposes. Mr. Speaker, Canadians must have confidence in the democratic and our electoral process. Not only do they need to know how to cast a ballot, Canadians want to be sure that legitimate votes are not cancelled by illegitimate ones. As I have demonstrated today, the Fair Elections Act goes a long way to ensuring that Canadians will have the confidence in the electoral process that they want and deserve. With the measures to eliminate vouching and communicate the many types of voter identification that are acceptable at the polls, I believe that the incidences of voter fraud will be greatly, greatly reduced. Together, all of these initiatives have advanced the voter identification process significantly from what it was a decade ago. Of course, there still remains the important debate that will continue on the Fair Elections Act, which will include the examination of the bill by the Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Canadians, interested parties and stakeholders will have the opportunity to make their views known. I have complete confidence that the committee, of which I am a member, will ensure that the study of the bill and the hearings are conducted in such a way as to allow a comprehensive review of the issues. I do not believe that to accomplish this, the committee needs to be directed by this House. And it is for that reason that I will not be supporting this motion, and I once again call upon members of this House to oppose this motion. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee that the filibustering will start, the list of witnesses will be established, we will start to have proper, full and robust hearings on this bill. We have heard from the minister already. The minister came, spent an hour, took every question directed at him, and then as soon as the minister was done, the filibustering by the NDP began. So I'm hoping tomorrow at committee we'll get on with the job that we are paid by Canadians to do, which is to do a robust, careful examination, invite dozens and dozens of witnesses to come in and give us their expert testimony on this bill. I look forward to hearing that testimony from Canadians here in the House of Commons when the committee resumes its good work that it needs to do for all Canadians. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Well said.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de la Pointe-de-l'Île.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Et il y a une différence entre le travail d'un député et le travail du gouvernement. J'aimerais simplement rappeler à mon collègue que le travail du gouvernement est bien sûr de consulter les Canadiens, mais j'espère qu'il n'avait pas oublié cette partie du travail d'un gouvernement. Et je trouve ça bizarre parce que la motion demande simplement au gouvernement de procéder à des consultations publiques. Et j'ai entendu aucun argument dans son discours à l'effet qu'il n'y a pas de bonne raison de consulter les Canadiens. Il a vanté sa loi, c'est correct, pas de problème, sauf qu'il se cache derrière des règles procédurales pour se défaire de la responsabilité du gouvernement de consulter les Canadiens. Monsieur le Président, il n'y a aucune argumentation que mon collègue a faite dans son discours qui permettrait de conclure à l'effet que consulter les Canadiens ne serait pas dans l'intérêt des Canadiens. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Mississauga, Streetsville.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for the question. She did refer to this motion suggesting that it's directing the government to tell the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to hold hearings across the country. The government doesn't tell committees of this House how to run their own business. The members, I'm a member, Mr. Speaker, I am a member of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. It is a very generally cordial committee. We have had witnesses in where the opposition have submitted their list of witnesses. The Conservative members have submitted our list of witnesses. Almost all the witnesses are included on a list and are invited to come and make their full presentations. That's the important work of the committee. The government is not directing the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. What would be nice, it would be nice to start tomorrow actually working on the bill instead of having the Hamilton Centre filibuster.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Malpeque.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd rather see the committee take direction from this House rather than what we know is going to happen, where Conservatives that are in the majority in the committee take their direction from the parliamentary secretary. We know that's what happens at all committees. But the member for Mississauga-Streetsville, Mr. Speaker, we heard a lot of the government spin on C-23, but we heard nothing on why he is opposed to engaging Canadians in their own community. And when he was talking, you know, Mr. Speaker, when he was speaking, Mr. Speaker, I almost had a vision. And that vision was that Conservative backbenchers in this place would actually stand up for democracy, break ranks with their government, and allow a committee to travel across the country and actually hear from Canadians. And so I'd ask the member opposite, does he think maybe even 3 or 4? You know, Conservative backbenchers, Mr. Speaker, I hear them get up and they talk. They're members of the government. They're not, Mr. Speaker. They're members of the governing party. And they have a responsibility to their constituents to stand up. Well, could he answer this? Does he think 1 or 2 or 3 might stand up for democracy rather than as they usually are, where they're puppets on a string taking their direction from a parliament?
The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Malpeque for that question. The fact of the matter is that the committee had set aside, I believe, 12 meeting dates, a huge list of potential witnesses that we were already starting to pre-vet as a committee would be excellent witnesses to come in. I actually think we can get a lot more accomplished and hear from a lot more interested parties by holding the hearings here in Ottawa. We have great technology, something called, maybe the member doesn't know what teleconferences are, but it's an excellent way to get people across the country, hear their expert testimony, not have to fly them halfway across the country or fly 12 members of a committee halfway across the country to get as good, if not better, testimony that we can use in our deliberations on the Act. So assuming the filibuster doesn't continue tomorrow morning, we're going to finally start to deal with this bill in a proper way under our procedures at committee.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires de l'honorable député de Brome-Missisquoi.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, je remercie le collègue pour son discours. J'aimerais savoir pourquoi Monsieur Marc Méran, qui est directeur général des élections, a été jusqu'à dire, en parlant du projet de loi, qu'il ne peut plus parler de démocratie dans ce pays avec cette réforme-là. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the unfortunate thing is we haven't had a chance at committee to hear from the Chief Electoral Officer because the NDP are filibustering the meeting starting. So I look forward to Monsieur Marin coming to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, giving us his expert testimony. But I do have to say that the previous Chief Electoral Officer gave this bill in its present form an A-. Said it was a very good, very strong piece of legislation. But I think it can be better. We'll take a look at the expert testimony that we get at committee. We'll listen to the witnesses, and we'll figure out if there's ways that we can make this an even stronger bill to make Canada's democratic process even better.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting to hear the member of Malpeque talk about democracy. When it was his party, he ran for a party that had a whole host of promises and systematically, one by one, turned their back on every single promise that they made to the Canadian people, Mr. Speaker. I don't recall that member, who is also a cabinet minister, if I'm not mistaken, standing up for democracy, standing up for what he told the Canadian people in advance. But I want to ask the member this. He's a member of the committee, and he's talking about the filibuster at committee. I wonder if he could expand on this, if he could help me explain how many people the committee has actually heard since we've had this bill before us, and why we are not hearing from witnesses, and if he agrees with me that Canadians give us $500 million a year is what it costs to send to run this place, to send members of Parliament back home every single weekend. I'm wondering if the honourable member can tell me some of the steps that he's taking in his riding to engage the people in his riding to hear what they're saying on this bill, and if he could just expand further on what this filibuster is and why it is that the opposition are so desperate to stop the committee hearings and stop hearing from people like the former Chief Electoral Officer who gave this bill an A-.
Honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister for this question. I'm paid to do a job. Canadians in Mississauga-Streetsville sent me here to work, and part of my most important responsibilities, I think, here as a Member of Parliament, is to do the work at committee. Committee is the real grunt work around here. Committee is where we hear directly from Canadians interested in a piece of legislation, interested in participating in the study, giving us their best knowledge. Well, guess what? At the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, we're not going to get that, because the honourable member for Hamilton Centre has decided he'd rather keep yammering at committee and filibustering instead of hearing from witnesses. So unfortunately, the first set of hearings we had on this bill, we had the minister come for an hour. He was straightforward. He answered every question clearly and directly from opposition and government members on the committee. And as soon as that was done and the minister's testimony was over, guess what? The filibuster gates opened up. And the second hour of committee, zero was accomplished, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely nothing on this bill. And I suspect when we reconvene at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, the filibustering member from Hamilton Centre will be at it again.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Rivière-des-Mille-Îles.
Président, et nous savons que ce projet de loi va affecter des milliers de Canadiens, des personnes aînées, les étudiants, mais les conservateurs ont dit simplement mais il faut que les étudiants amènent leur carte étudiante pour pouvoir voter. Mais ils ne savent même pas que les cartes étudiantes ne contiennent pas d'adresse de l'étudiant. Donc, c'est à un tel point qu'ils ne sont pas au courant de la réalité des Canadiens, de l'expérience vécue des Canadiens. Donc, c'est pourquoi il faut qu'on voyage autour du pays pour consulter les Canadiens, pour parler de leur réalité, pour les consulter sur les détails de ce projet de loi. Je pense que les Canadiens méritent une étude approfondie de ce projet de loi. Ils méritent qu'ils soient consultés avant de changer les règles des élections, parce que les élections appartiennent aux Canadiens, non pas au gouvernement.
The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville, you have about 40 seconds.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know there's been a lot made about the student ID thing, so let's remember a couple things. First of all, you got to be 18 years or older to vote in Canada. So we're not talking about high school students here, and we're not talking about younger people. That's one. Second, though, if you're 18 or over and you're in a post-secondary education institution, you will certainly have student ID, photo ID in most cases, from the universities and colleges I'm used to. It may not have your specific address, but then you bring in the second piece of ID, your lease where you are at the campus, a copy of your transcripts, as another speaker has said, that actually is mailed to maybe your parents' home, that's your principal residence. It's not just one piece of ID. Student ID card, transcript, you can vote.